Dummerston Conservation Commission, and we're really happy to have you all here. This is a phenomenal program. I've seen it before. John never lets us down. It's really great to see see all the pictures of his ramblings. So welcome. If you'd like to make a donation that helps us to keep these programs going and so that we can have them all videotaped, there's a jar on the table. We use a lot of that money to support educational programs at Dummerston School, as well as these kinds of programs. So, any questions or? Okay. This is John Anderson. How you doing?
Hello. Thank you all for coming out. As you can see, I'm going to talk about wildflowers, but when you're out walking around, you see a lot more than wildflowers. So there's some other things sprinkled in there that I found interesting, and I hope you will too. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes talking about the survey, town-wide survey that we've been doing. A few boring statistics, and we'll make that very brief, and then we'll get into the pretty pictures. This is my wife, Noreen Cooper, she put this together from pictures that we both took. Okay, old familiar territory. There are 30.8 square miles in Dummerston. If you ever decide to take a survey of the wildflowers in the town, you should learn that before you start. Every square mile has 640 acres. If you do the math, you got 19,584 acres. Now you could spend an afternoon on 1 acre, so obviously I'm never going to complete this. That's okay, it keeps me busy. Every acre has 43,560 square feet. You do the math on that and you end up something akin to the national debt. It just is a meaningless, okay? Dummerston is blessed with more roads than most of our surrounding towns. There's 59 miles of, I believe is the figure. And when you go out looking for wildflowers, you soon realize every road has 2 sides. You're up to 118 miles, and then not all of your flowers come up at the same time, so you got to walk them all about 3 times in a year. So you're up to 354 miles of walking just to cover the roadsides. I have done them all once, unsure about the second time. Some of them we do frequently, but it gives you an idea of the magnitude. Now you look at a map of Vermont and see how many towns there are in it. It's a wonder we know anything about what's going on out there. It's good to know a little bit about the terrain where you're going to be walking, because there are 1,400 feet maybe elevation change in the town. So if you're going to head up to the high parts of town over here and you're down in the valley, it's going to be a tough walk. You do see interesting things, but familiarity with the terrain is a good thing to know before you head out. And bedrock. This Waits River Formation is a little more limey than some of the other areas. This Black Mountain area is acid granite and thin soil. So depending on where you go, you have different expectations of what you might see. So figuring out learning as much as you can about your town before you start out is important. This is what we've found so far. There's 4 or 5 more that haven't been added in yet. So as you can see, things start out kind of slow in April and then really get going May and June, and then by September you have some remnants, but nothing is really starting to flower at that point. I have not broken down the trees, shrubs, and woody vines into months. If I did, May would be probably the dominant month as far as flowerings. I don't know if I'll ever get to that. That's more than a winter chore. Okay. I list native wildflowers, introduced wildflowers, invasive ugly wildflowers, but they have to persist for a number of seasons. This came in with mulch or seed that they put down after a road improvement project. Came up that one year and has not come up again, so doesn't make the list. Okay, an idea of what you ought to take with you if you're going out looking. And you probably have some things that of your own that you would add to that list, but depends on what you want to carry on any given day. This is a little confusing, but the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department has this non-game and natural heritage division. They have 2 lists. One is threatened and endangered species of plants. Those are ones that might be driven to extinction pretty quickly. And then they have rare and unusual species which could become threatened and endangered in the future. The lists are available online at this site. We have in Dummerston found, I think, 3 dozen plants that are on the list. So out of that 720 species, you had 680 something that are of no interest at all to the state, and then this handful that are. But they track, especially the threatened and endangered species. They like to keep track of them. They like to know where populations are. So every year I send them a few emails with, they want GPS locations and all this good stuff. But, so that's enough on that. Okay. Oop. Page here. Yeah. Yeah. This eagle was not screaming at me. There were 2 ospreys who were diving at him, trying to drive him off the nest. I took one quick photo from near the nest, and then I backed off 1/8 of a mile or something and tried to get, because I didn't want to disturb them in their nesting. And when I got off in the distance, it started to rain, and I was quite a ways from my car, but I took a couple of pictures, and I really like them. I like the effect. Kind of glad I got them.
How could you tell it was an eagle nest and not the osprey nest?
Because the Audubon people had reported an eagle nest in that area. I just didn't know where it was and got too close to it accidentally and had to apologize to the eagles. Yeah. We think of hepatica as a very early plant, and it is, and the flowers come up. Last year's leaves will still be there, but the new leaves of the year won't come up until after the flowers are really out. But This is a plant that's easily fooled by fluctuations in temperature. And in 2016, Christmas Day, we had hepatica blooming. It had been a cold spell followed by an unusual warm spell, and they just said, well, winter's over. And the flowers seem to survive. They kind of close up, dangle down, the snow covers them, and they seem to know what they're doing. These are rosettes of spring whitlow grass. It's an alien species, and those rosettes are about the size of your thumbnail. There's a cornfield on the other side of town, and they cover that field. Now the flowers have gotten taller, and it just looks like the whole field is covered in a nasty mold or something. But it's one of the early, very early species. Also called Mayflower. Steep slopes, ledgy areas where they get a lot of sun. Quite common. The leaves are evergreen. I had a favorite spot I used to visit, was near my house where I could find them, and the wing plow from the snow plow scoured the bank, and so now I have to go over the other side of town to get an early picture. Okay. Another very early, these are the earliest violets I see, and these are the leaves. They haven't even unfurled yet, but the flowers are ready for business. Tiny little things. Yeah. Yeah, I never realized it until I got looking in the books, but there are two species of cohosh in our area, common and giant cohosh. Not sure which one this was, but the minute they break ground, the flowers start opening, and they end up 2.5 feet tall.
It's black cohosh? That's a tall one, but it doesn't have a
Right,
blossom.
has the white flower spike. Yeah, I don't find it. I'm gonna keep looking.
Come over to my house.
Yeah, I've seen it there, yes. Okay. Yeah, very common shrub. The outer flowers are sterile. They don't do anything, and these little center flowers are the ones that attract the bees and end up setting fruit. Just they got their own strategy. When you're out looking for wildflowers, you're keyed into color, and one of the early spring things you see is this scarlet cup fungus, and it always fools me. I always go over and thinking there's going to be some exotic flower there, and it's maple woods early in the spring, fairly common. I always move snakes out of the road and turtles and whatnot. This was a good warm day, and he was ready to fight. It was a tiny snake. I picked him up, and within seconds he'd bitten me 12 times. He was like a sewing machine. But I held garter snake. I held him in one hand and got the camera in the other, and that was. But he looks like he's going to try to eat me alive. But I always move him. Whoop, you're jumping. Okay, swamps are full of this stuff early in the spring. It's also called horse sugar. From the name, I assume that horses like it, but I don't have a horse to try it on. And if I fed it to someone else's horse and it did bad things to him, so. Yeah. Whenever I saw snow fleas like this, I always assumed they were the dumb ones. They got caught in the surface film of the water. Well, one day I did some reading, and lo and behold, they're aquatic. They live on the surface of the water, this particular species. So when you get out and look around, and then you go home and do a little research, you pick up little oddities like that.
Did they jump? Could you see them jump?
I didn't. I'm assuming they probably can. The surface film of the water for something that small would be a pretty solid surface. Now, you notice two flowers on one stem. That's two pictures of the same. All my life I've seen moccasin flowers, one flower on a stem. And I saw this one and didn't think much about it, walked away about 100 feet and said, I'll go back and take a picture. That one's different. So you do see some little variations in flowers out there. You notice the green is paler than a common dandelion. The flowers are a little different color. I put this in as an example of how when you find something and you go to the guides and research it, you find out there are numerous species. You know, there's common dandelion, there's red-seeded dandelion, there's fall dandelion, and there's dwarf dandelion. So by working back and forth between what I see and the various field guides and books, slowly learning.
Do you know if they're edible? Like,
I wasn't that hungry. Okay. These used to be common, but I think it was maybe a virus swept through and most of them died. They become small trees, and there's a little population of them down along the West River Trail in Brattleboro, maybe 8 stems, and there's a few in Castleton. And those are, at least a year or two ago, those were the only ones that the state knew about. Maybe others have turned out up in the quite big flowers, showier than the other dogwoods. Yeah. 2.5 to 3 inches. Okay. Very pretty flower, but they're tiny. The flowers are fairly tiny. When they were doing the work on the Velco Southern Loop electric project, they disturbed a lot of ground and tons of these came up. But they can't stand competition from other plants. So when the grasses and so forth move in, this stuff retreats to ledges, places like that where a few will hang on until the next chance. I found some up on Black Mountain on top of a granite boulder that was just slightly concave. It had a little skim of rotting pine needles in it, and it, yeah, it got occasional rain, and that was enough for it until next opportunity. Yeah. Colony forming. Huge swaths of mountainside just covered with these in the spring. There are 2 species. They're told apart mainly by the width of their leaves. One species is more south of us, one is more north of us, and all the ones I find here seem to be a hybrid. I can't make them fit either species. They're just, but they're beautiful little flowers, and they're prolific, and they seem to thrive. Yeah. This is a parasite on tree roots. See, it has very little chlorophyll and no leaves. The field guides will tell you it grows in the forest. I happen to find it in a field, but it's a field where the alder brush is starting to crowd in, so they may be latching on to the root system of that. I'm not sure what the plant is. These are jumping spiders. Last year up on Putney Mountain, I looked down and one is on my knee. I'm not crazy about spiders. I mean, I don't run screaming from the room or anything, but I took my finger and I flicked it off into space. And 5 minutes later, there's a spider on my knee. So flicked it off again, and 5 minutes later, there's a spider. All day long, that spider was on my knee. I went home, I said, I'm going to learn about this. They attach themselves with a strand of silk so that when they jump at something and miss, they can... they actually have very appealing faces with all those little eyes. I still don't like spiders. Yeah. Just in there because I like the flowers. They're bright and cheerful. Find them along the roadside and a couple places in town. Very unique form. Who wouldn't like it, right?
Do you find the white form also?
All I've ever found is pink, but that wouldn't surprise me. Yeah. This I took on a screen at my house, but often when you're out, you'll find moths, night flying moths that are waiting out the day, hanging on flowers and shrubs. And, I find these guys on quite often on reeds that grow up out of the water. They'll hang right over the water and wait all day and fly at night. These are a favorite with hummingbirds. The hummingbirds can hover because the flowers are dangling. They can hover under them, and these are the nectaries here. So they can run their tongue up in there and get a little reward for their effort. Right now, the columbine is kind of at its peak. They're everywhere. Yeah. These are tiny little fungus, and you can't really tell, but they're in standing water, and they grow on dead leaves in the standing water. When you're in a shaded woods, they do actually seem to glow like that, like they're on fire. They're tiny, inch tall maybe. Yeah. This is the reproductive parts of those slugs. Slugs are hermaphroditic. They're both going to end up pregnant. And their reproductive parts come out of their necks. Now, if you go online and look up mating slugs, they're actually species that climb up plants and hang on those parts and dangle in the air and swirl around, and it's one of those things that you find on the internet. Okay. Bizarre looking little caterpillar. The white admiral and the red spotted purple intergrade. We don't get pure forms usually of either. You get something that's, half and half, but this is what the caterpillar looks like. You might overlook it as, bird poop or something like that, but you see a lot of caterpillars, and quite often I'll take a picture of a flower, or Noreen will, and we go home, blow it up, and suddenly there's an interesting insect or some kind of noteworthy creature on the flower. So you can't avoid all those nice little things. Yeah. Always a quandary when you find a big snapping turtle in the road, but if you can move them, do it. I watched the state herpetologists do it, and they go up and they actually grab them, stick the fingers right down in the shell behind the head, and then grasp them back here. You don't want to grab them by the leg or the tail, because when they retract that back in, it will take your skin off. It will literally rip the skin. You either got to let go or you lose skin, and I learned that the hard way. But I've moved a number of them using the methods that Jim Andrews, the state herpetologist, showed me, and I have yet to get bitten. The turtles do hiss and lunge, and the hissing is not a threat. The hissing is to expel air from their lungs so that they can withdraw back into the shell. It sounds threatening to us, but I hate to leave them in the road to get smashed. And most of them are not. I mean, if you get a really big one, it's a chore, but it's worth it.
How do you do it? How do you do it? Just put on big gloves and...
No, I do what the state herpetologist does. I grab them right by the back of the collar and...
Nice.
I'm going to say, for people who are chicken like me, I just let them bite a big stick and
Yeah.
drag them to the other side of the road.
That works too. I've known people to use the floor mats from their car. Anything you can do to... Okay. This is a state-listed rare and unusual species, and I find it down by the river, and I find it up on the old ski slopes of the Maple Valley ski area. The fringed polygula that we looked at a little while ago, all these little florets are pretty much like the fringed polygula flower, miniature versions. There's, I think, 5 milkwort species in Vermont, and 3 of them have been found in this area, maybe.
I was just wondering if this is a rare or threatened species, what does when you report them, do the department do anything about them, or are there any rules or regulations surrounding?
There's a state law that is only for threatened and endangered, not for rare and unusual. Threatened and endangered would be 5 or 6 populations or less in the whole state. And the law, of course, being written by old farmers and loggers, exempts farming and logging. So you and I can't go dig them up and sell them in a roadside stand, but if they're in the middle of a cornfield, the farmer can go about his business, and, or, if they're in a woodlot, the logger can go about his business. So a weak law, but a suggestion.
There's no real protections then for it, or requirements of a landowner who has them on their property.
Right. If something is in the woods, sometimes foresters will write into a management plan for the woodlot that there's a no-go area, but it's up to the homeowner, the landowner. Yeah. Where are we at here? Yeah. This is, fairly unusual, but there's 3 colors, same plant. You can find them in a kind of a lemony yellow, almost brick red, or this is the commonest, the orange. And we've seen them with maybe 25 flowers on a single stem. They like wet thickets, riverbanks. They can tower up over most of the other stuff. And I think this one was right down along the West River Trail. The variegated leaves are the giveaway for this. Flowers are interesting. They dangle down. If you want to picture one, you have to tip it up so you can, the whole plant is, 4 inches tall maybe. Statewide, quite unusual, but in Dummerston they're common. There are a lot of them. That would be a rare and unusual species in the state, not a threatened and endangered. We were out looking for birds during a bird program at Ed and Mary Ellen's house, and these were growing in the woods out there, so everyone else was looking up at the birds. I'm trying to keep people from stepping on the showy orchids, but I don't think they've come back. They like rich woods, and there is a little patch of rich woods out there.
And they like the lady slippers, they live on a fungus, and after that fungus is gone, they're gone.
I assume so, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful.
Mm. Yeah. If you're familiar with aphids, you'll know these are all females, and they reproduce all summer, producing all females. And late in the season, they'll produce some males, and then they disperse. But in the meantime, the ant's trying to keep them together because they're secreting honeydew, which is aphid poop, which is high in sugar contents, and the ants like it. Something you read about all the time in the little nature books, but kind of fun to see firsthand. The little tufts are the flowers, and these are the fruits, the seed pods. A lot of your older field guides call these squaw root, which is extremely offensive to any Native American person. The newer field guides are calling them oak drops, and some of them call them cancer root, but if you have an old field guide, make yourself a little note there and get rid of the name squaw root. It's politically incorrect. And
Ooh, I've never seen that one.
this is a garden escape. A lot of it grows down along the West River. And if you were to go down Rice Farm Road to the entrance to the rail trail and look at the gravel bar island out in the middle of the river, a week or two from now, it'll be just purple. They apparently can grow just about anywhere. Yeah. Beautiful plant. Yeah. I startled this guy. He was a little cuss. And he ran into this vegetation which was probably 8 to 10 inches tall, and he thought he was hidden because the leaf here was blocking his sight of me. My feet were just out of this picture. I told him I could see him, but he, I finally scuffled my feet around and he ran into some denser, but he's got something to learn if he's gonna make it down to your garden to eat, you know? Yeah.
Pretty.
Yeah. I have a field guide to beetles at home, list 1,400 beetle species, and this is the one they chose for the cover.
Gorgeous.
They're dung beetles.
Oh,
This one had found a pile of dog poop. And what they'll do is dig a hole and drag some of that poop down into the hole and lay their eggs on it, and that's what the larvae eat. This picture doesn't really show it very well, but they have a kind of a rhinoceros horn on their nose, and real robust species, that horn can get pretty big. And that's what the males use to compete with. Only a couple of times I've ever run across one of these in Dummerston. Like a lot of things that are iridescent like that, the digital photography doesn't get all the colors just the way you see them. They're actually much brighter than that. I put this in as an example of plants that you're not going to find by color. They grow in patches of grass down along the river. They look just like a sickly plant of some sort, kind of pale yellowish green. They're down in the grass. You hardly notice them. They are rare and unusual, listed by the state, and the tubercle, and the name is that little bump right there. They used to be called southern rain orchids, and some wise guy changed the name just to confuse me. Yeah, not uncommon, but fun to see. All three of these deer were just a picture of health. They were, in tall clover there, fat and happy. Yeah. These are predators. And if you were to go down on the West River Trail and walk, and watch the trail, every once in a while, something will pop up in front of you, fly 15 or 20 feet, and then land. And they always land facing you. But they're predators. They're out looking for insects to eat. There's a lot of different species. One of them, the river cobble tiger beetle, is a species of interest to the state, and it can be found on the West River. Yeah, you can't really see it there, but the tortoise in the name is because the edge of the beetle flares out like the shell on a turtle. And of course the golden is obvious, but if you get reading up on them, they look golden because they have a layer of liquid built into them, and they can force that liquid out and change color. They can be orange or golden. Did you want to stop for a cookie break?
Why don't we just have the cookies after? Is that okay with everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
I always wondered why a plant would evolve such a shape. Obviously it has a reason, and the reason, it works. You often find them in places that have been disturbed, construction sites and things like that, and they'll pop up for a few years and then they're gone. You got to find them somewhere else.
Were the petals sticky? Did you notice?
I didn't. Yeah. Probably a yearling. Was quite startled to see me, but I did manage to get a couple of quick pictures before it disappeared. But it went, this is the West River Trail. It went from the trail, I could hear it hit the water down in the river, thrash and flounder across, go up over the bank. I could hear the cars braking on Route 30. And then the bank on the other side of Route 30 goes straight up to Upper Dummerston Road, and that moose went up there like it was nothing. Yeah. It also appeared to be pretty healthy, which that was 3 years ago, I think. So, this plant is parasitic on grass. Now, that seems to give you a lot of room for, opportunity. It has these little flowers, and then it ripens these seed pods, and when they dry out, the wind blows, they rattle. Up in the upper valley, this is an agricultural pest, to the point where farmers are getting a greatly diminished hay yield because of this stuff. Two of our power lines that have had work done on them ended up with this stuff, and it was everywhere there was disturbed soil. But the natural state of a power line is brush. When the brush came back in, these guys get squeezed out. So now where I probably could find them in one place. So that works for power lines, but it won't work for the farmers because they're not going to let the fields go back to brush. Yeah. Looks just like a big red ant, but if you look closely on the tail, there's some, you can't really see it, but there's some narrow yellow stripes. This is actually a solitary wasp. The females are flightless. Now, there's quite a few different species of velvet ants, and quite a few of them are very hairy. Thus the name. This one is pretty much smooth. One of them, they have quite a painful sting apparently, because one of them is nicknamed the cow killer. I wasn't going to pick this one up. Yeah. There are two different species. I'm not sure if these are the same or different ones, but one species has leaves that are attached to the stem with a very short stalk. The other one has leaves that clasp the stem and form a cup. That's the only difference to them. The flowering sequence is a bit odd because they start at the top and flower down. Most flowers that have a flower head like that start at the bottom and work their way up. So this one over here is just about done. This one is kind of halfway through its flowering.
That's not native, is it? Is it native?
Not to this area, I don't think. Yeah. Yeah. If you read in the moth book about primrose moths, they say they're quite rare, and your best chance of ever seeing one is to go look in primroses.
No, that's not nice.
This is a crab spider that's making a meal of one of the primrose moths. And you realize that all of the pollinators, all of the insects that come to flowers are running a huge risk because there are ambush bugs, there's spiders, there's praying mantises. It's not a free meal and a paradise. This is nature being nature, and this guy wasn't quite on the ball enough. This caterpillar is also called a camouflage looper. It's the caterpillar of wavy-lined emerald moth, and they cut pieces of the flower petal, and using silk that's produced from a silk gland in their mouth, they tie pieces of flower onto their back. Now these guys are all faded out, and they will get on the ball and replace all that faded out stuff with some nice fresh yellow. I find them quite frequently on black-eyed Susans. Find them fascinating. They don't do the flower much good, but chewing pieces out of it. Okay. How many people in the room drive Middle Road in Dummerston? Well, you all went by within about 4 feet of this, and you were just paying too much attention to your driving. It was growing right next to the road, came up like a beacon there, and then the road crew came along and mowed it down, and it branched out from the stub and it came up again. This is the second plant with no chlorophyll that I found. The other one was a milkweed, closely related, and if it was an animal you'd say it's an albino. They actually, the veins are kind of pinkish, but of course in an albino animal you're seeing the blood vessels in the animal. That's what causes the pink look. You got no blood vessels in a Indian hemp. So I sent a picture of the milkweed I found to the state botanist, and he just said, yeah, that's interesting. But abnormal pigmentation is the term is leucistic. Birds that have partially, we had a chickadee come into our feeder that instead of a black cap, he was all white down to yay high. Actually looked like he was in the KKK, Strange looking little bird. But, so I don't know what you would call this, probably leucistic. Indian hemps and milkweeds are connected at the root level. They form colonies, so this plant may have been drawing nutrients from the surrounding Indian hemps. It sure wasn't making its own food. Lacking certain things there. That's a juvenile gray tree frog. We were looking for great blue lobelia, which is very rare in the area. We had a great blue lobelia in Dummerston that grew in a riverside thicket, and I got this big, had multiple stems. It was a magnificent specimen, and Hurricane Irene took it down to Massachusetts or somewhere. Since then, we found one little stunted one out on the river cobble down in Brattleboro, and one in a roadside pull-off where people cleaned out their trucks. So it was probably introduced from someone's yard litter out of their garden. But so we didn't find what we were looking for, but we found a really neat little frog. Yeah, very common pond snails. I was walking by a pond and I saw these snails grazing algae off a rock. So I said, well, I'll get a picture of one. So I scooped one out to get a picture, and it didn't look right. It's red. So I went home, did some research. Noreen went online, and come to find out these snails have red blood just like ours. Now, most of your slugs and snails don't. So it's, as a species, it's odd in that it has red blood. This one is odd in that it has no skin pigmentation to hide the color of the blood. And that's a result of a recessive gene, and if both parents have the gene, the offspring are born with no pigmentation. So out of all the snails I could have grabbed out of the pond, I grabbed one of the interesting ones. If I'd gotten one of the other ones, I never would have known about that. Yeah. All the anadromous fishes come up the river and spawn, and things like this, after they spawn, they die. Now you can go down to the fish ladder in Vernon and see all kinds of eels, and you know deep down that they come up the rivers and they go through their whole life cycle, but you seldom see it. Once or twice a year, I put on some old sneakers and walk down the river. There are places on the riverbank you just can't get to from land to see, and a good hot day, it's a, you know, you might as well be waist deep in the river. So, and this was, I don't think I found any interesting flowers, but
We snorkel a lot in the West River, and we've noticed it's about the third week in June, just when you want to be swimming. That there are a lot of them, and it's so
Wow.
unpleasant, we don't like to snorkel.
I never heard of them bothering anybody.
Well, they don't bother anybody, they just.
Yeah, it's how I am with spiders. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a caterpillar in the. This is a black-billed cuckoo, and cuckoos are caterpillar specialists, and they're one of the few things that will eat like tent caterpillars, hairy caterpillars. And they eat so many that their stomach gets lined with all those irritating hairs, and they actually regurgitate their stomach lining and start over again. So they're specialists in caterpillars, and the fact that they're around may indicate that we're in a caterpillar outbreak. You know, we may be seeing the tent caterpillars. See where I am here. This is a viney plant. Late in the summer, it grows up over thickets, drapes itself all over everything, and it puts out these clusters of these kind of maroonish brown flowers, and it has a very heavy odor that I find rather overpowering. But you'll know if you're within 30 feet of it if the wind is right. I mean, it's powerfully scented, very common, but an interesting flower. Yeah. I think there are 7 gentian species listed in Vermont. I find this one and one that escapes from people's gardens. This is all they ever do. They don't open. But bumblebees will actually come up and force their way down into that flower. And it's an epic struggle. I mean, they fight every inch of the way to get in there and every inch of the way to get out, but they do it. Very late summer. We see these flowering, wet thickets, riverbanks, places like that. This little member of the mint family, dead common. I mean, they're everywhere, but I think it's stylistically got to be the neatest flower around. They're long, and they actually will curl farther, long stamens. They also are tolerant of very poor growing conditions and road salt. So if you were to go down Route 30 late in the summer, and there'd be a strip of bare sand over the guardrails, and then just beyond that you can find these. The flowers are not very durable. You'll come across a plant that might have 24 flowers open, and there'd be a little bit of wind or a little rain, and all the flowers are on the ground. And they start over again. But for my money, this is my favorite flower.
Did you say it's in the mint family?
Pardon?
Did you say it was a mint?
Mint family, yeah.
How big is that?
Well, the plants get foot to 16 inches tall, and the flowers are ½ inch maybe. They're not very big. Yeah. Back to my spider phobia. This one was crossing the road. These are baby spiders. She carries them around till they get to a certain size. Quite a few years ago, a field near our house was mowed. Hay wasn't taken, it was just cut down. And I was out walking around, and I looked down, and there's one of these spiders, and it's a mini tarantula. It's a big spider. And it's got a slew of these babies on her back. So I said, Noreen's got to see this. I went back to the house to get her, and then I realized the acres of hayfield. And I went back out, and that spider was big enough, so we found it again immediately. Yeah, it was. This one was a moderately sized one. It was crossing the road near our house. They're hunters, active hunters. They don't build webs. Although hunting with that, you know. All those babies. Yeah. World milkwort is I think it's rare and unusual listed. You can see where flowers have fallen off, florets. It just keeps growing and putting out new ones all through the season. And the leaves grow in a whorl, but the ones I find, they don't grow in a whorl. There's a separate species, scientific name of it, they tacked on ambigua. It doesn't really match what it's supposed to, but we found quite a large population of that in Brattleboro, just by chance. About 15 years ago, I spotted one of these guys in with the turkey vultures down in Brattleboro, and I reported it to the rare bird hotline, and after they sent someone down to confirm that I actually knew what I was seeing, they sent me an email and said that since 1927, that was the 17th sighting in the state or something. Now we see them every year. This one was on the street in West Dummerston Village eating something. Yeah. I came around the corner and saw it, and without checking my rear view mirror, stopped dead in the street, got my camera, took a picture through the windshield, and it stood there. So I said, well, it's being obliging, so I rolled ahead a car length and took another picture. Rolled ahead another car length and took a picture. I finally was so close, I having trouble seeing it over the hood of the car, and it flew up onto a telephone pole, waited for me to go by, and went back to finish its, yeah, the sign of a, potentially maybe a sign of a warming climate. Yeah. These guys, if you pick them up and you handle them, they exude blood from their leg joints. The blood is an irritant that will raise blisters on you. There are lots of different species. If you go out, say in September, and look on goldenrod, you'll see kind of black, kind of flat black, matte black little beetles on the goldenrod, and they're a kind of blister beetle. These guys are parasitic on bees. and they go through what's called hypermetamorphosis. They lay an egg, the egg hatches out into this hyperactive little creature that climbs up a flower, waits for a bee, latches onto the bee, rides back to the hive, and then settles in and becomes a fat, happy grub eating the bees' eggs and larvae. Now there are a lot of solitary bees and things like that out there. I don't know specifically. They probably can't be fussy. They probably have to go with whatever bee comes by. But I see these guys quite a lot. Never had any trouble with them. Try not to handle them. If you were ever going to keep a plant as a house pet, this would be the one to get. They actually react to touch. If you touch these leaflets, they kind of close up. They also seem to do it in the evening when it gets dark. It's known in Brattleboro and Dummerston, but I don't think anywhere else in the state. There was a patch of it right where the I-91 bridge project went, and supposedly they moved the plants, but I don't know. Okay. Yeah. I don't know if any of you are familiar with slime molds, but slime molds are in a whole class by themselves. They're not animals, they're not plants, they're not molds, they're not a fungus. They're unique to themselves. They actually move. They ooze kind of slowly along, and they engulf little bits of rotten stuff and bacteria and whatever and consume it. They can break apart into separate pieces, go through the soil and come back together. This particular one, in parts of Mexico, people cook it like scrambled eggs and eat it. Now, I like food, but when I come down and Noreen says slime mold for breakfast, no. Thank you, I'll eat out. No. Yeah. These plants never seem to be green. Always look like they're a little sickly. I find them growing in places where all the topsoil is gone. There's just sand, gravel. Usually with a little water, even running water, seepage. But they're one of the host plants for the buckeye. The buckeye is totally unique in that it cannot live in Vermont. There's no form of this, not as an egg, a larvae, not in the pupa, not as an adult. It just can't live here. So every year it colonizes its way north, and then it works its way back south. And there are a few other host plants, but I've found the butterflies in two places where there were good colonies of the slender Gerardia. Yeah, let's see. This stuff grows in the deep woods late in the summer. It's a saprophyte. Consumes rotting stuff. And this one is the spotted coral root. It's fairly common. There's an autumn coral root, which is of interest to the state, and I've been looking for a decade and have not yet found. But always hopeful. I check every plant I see. Okay. I don't know if any of you have run across these. These aphids affix these little white waxy strands of stuff to their butt ends until they look like little Q-tips. And then, if they're disturbed, they dance. Okay, not the greatest photography, but... And that's where they get the name the boogie woogie aphid. Now someone has filmed them like this and put it to music, and you can find it online. Very entertaining. Just look up boogie woogie aphids. Two or 3 years ago, they were just everywhere in our neighborhood. Okay, now you go on the next step. This is a fungus that will only grow on the honeydew secreted by boogie woogie aphids. It will not grow anywhere else. Won't grow on the honeydew of any other aphid. That seems like a risky way to... Yeah. Yeah. You imagine how many spores they have to put out there for one of them to land in the right place to continue the species. It just is mind-boggling, the odds, but they do it. So the term for that is an obligate species. It will not accept any other host. Okay. A lot of praying mantises, and early in the season they're small and you don't notice them, but late in the season they get pretty big. A lot of them are introduced species from Asia and places like that were brought here to control various agricultural pests. I don't know if they do that, but they're very interesting. Some of them get 4 inches long, maybe. They get pretty big. This was the lawn chair of one of our hawk watchers, and he was eating his lunch, and the praying mantis came down to see what was up. They quite active flyers. Once you get into September, I mean, you'll have this and that'll go through a second flowering, but mainly what you see are seed heads of things like thimbleweed, and this one was actually in good shape this spring. It went through the winter in fine shape. Okay. Yeah. Frost weeds will be coming on in a couple weeks. They have these big showy yellow flowers. Each flower lasts 1 day. So it makes you wonder, how many of them actually get visited by pollinators, but it doesn't really make much difference to the plant because they have a second flowering down in the leaf axils of flowers that never open, and they self-pollinate, which quite a few flowers do. So they will always manage to reproduce. There are quite a few of these down along the bike trail. The really interesting thing about them is they have very fibrous woody stems, and if you get the right weather conditions on, say, the 1st of December, the nights are cold, the days are warm, they wick up moisture, and the moisture freezes, it splits the stem, and they send out these kind of ribbon candy frost formations that really, defy imagination. They don't show up well in photographs. It used to be thought that frost weeds were the only flowers that did this, but anything with a fibrous stem under the right weather conditions will produce these frost flowers. Yeah. You have to get out in the morning to see them, because the minute the sun gets on them, even on a cold day, they're gone. This thing, I don't know what it is. Last summer it came up near my compost pit, which is a signal that it probably was introduced in one potted plant or something. It got all ready to flower, and the people who do our field maintenance showed up and mowed the field. Lo and behold, it came up again, and it was all ready to flower again, and that was November. And the weather forecast was for a real cold night, so I went out and I cut off a chunk of it, put it in a glass on the windowsill, and it flowered. A square stem, very much like a mint, flower clusters like a mint, leaves like a mint, but does not match anything. Before we get out of this little tangle, I'll tell you about one more plant that I don't have a picture of. I found a little plant in a cornfield 3 years ago. And cornfields, of course, are plowed. 3 years I tried to identify that stupid thing, to the point where I would go over just before they plowed, dig one up and put it in a pot, put it on the windowsill, but they never did well. They never really seemed to do much. Just stayed a little stunted, a little plant. This year, as the growing season was coming on, I didn't want to be looking up trying to figure out something that I'd worked on for 3 years, so I took pictures, wrote a description, sent it to the state biologist and his assistant, and I got back 2 emails that said, we don't know. So they sent it to a fellow named Arthur Gilman, who wrote The Flora of Vermont, and I mean, he must have a brain like an encyclopedia. And he knew what it was, and it was something called tiny mousetail. And the nearest population of it is on the coast of Massachusetts, down in the southern corner of the state, and in a cornfield in Dummerston. So these plants are always moving around, and you don't know with we've been having relatively warm weather. Are we going to start getting a lot of, we've got the invasives, maybe some of the other stuff will be working their way into the area. So there's a possibility that this end of the state might have an influx of new species, much like the birds have colonized north. So.
And it was called what?
Tiny mousetail. Yeah. So that's what I have for you. And if you have questions, comments, or anything.
So John, I was looking at the April flowers, and is it pretty typical that the early spring flowers flower before the leaves?
A lot of them, yeah. A lot of them, not all of them, but yeah.
And what's the biological reason for that? To get the first pollinators to come around? Or?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't seem to make sense, but there may be flies or something that are the pollinators that they want to reach. I don't know. Yeah, I'd like to know. Maybe you can look it up. Okay.
Are there other questions?
Yeah.
Are you thinking of putting this into a book?
No, not really. Yeah, if I'm out looking for wildflowers and I see something off in the distance that's not a wildflower, I just ramble off in another direction. So I like the freedom to do what I darn well please.
How long have you been so interested in flowers?
Well, I've been working on this for 8 years or more. Yeah,
What's your
favorite guide? You probably didn't know them all.
Well, the Newcomb's Wildflowers has a very good system to help you find. But I have 4 different wildflower guides, and I use them all, and they're not enough. There are field guides can only cover common things, and if you go out in the spring and you see shadbush in flower, and then you go and look in the wildflowers of Vermont, you'll find there are 11 different varieties, but that's nothing. If you see a hawthorn in flower, and you look those up, some guides list 49 species, and some of them just say best left to the experts. And no two agree. One might say, well, there's only 23 species. These guys are splitting off things that are really belong in this group. And yeah, hawthorn is good enough for me.
Do you find that after a while you just get an instinct that you can find this stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. I
You
will.
can take a person, well, no offense to anybody, but just take somebody here. You can take them, the flowers will be almost kicking them in the shins, and they can't see them.
Yeah.
But you've seen them, and you haven't done that
Yeah.
before. It's just
Like the bird watchers.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is. It is. It's not just flowers and birds. It's anything in nature. You
Yeah.
have an
You
instinct
get keyed
for it.
into it, and because I write down everything I see, I can go to my journals for 2 or 3 years, and I'll tell Noreen, well, within a day or two, we'll be seeing this or this, and we'll go out and look, and usually within a very short period. Sometimes I hit it right on the day,
Is this an ongoing process? Are you continuing?
Yes, but this is, it can't be my sole priority in life. I have home maintenance and car maintenance and
Hawks?
yes, yeah, hawk watching in the fall, but if I'm out somewhere doing a little work, I'm always kind of looking with part of my brain. I mean, 10 years ago when I was working, I'd be working at someone's house, and next thing I'd be wandering off into the thicket. They're pretty tolerant.
So your comment about your journals and keeping track of when things are blooming,
Yeah.
does it at all deviate, like this
Yeah.
year where it was such a strange winter, did things bloom later, or?
Things will deviate short term, but over the long run, I mean, you might be behind for 2 or 3 weeks, and then boom, you'll catch up and be right back on track within a day or two. You very, very seldom go for long periods. And these plants don't object to cool, wet weather. I mean, they've been doing real well this spring. Good growing weather for them. Have some more questions.